This is everything you need to know about @export in Godot. And when I say export, you might be thinking exporting your game, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about GDScript. When you have a variable in GDScript, you can add the @export annotation in front of it to make it editable from the inspector. And you can see how insanely useful this is. And you might be thinking, of course I know @export, that's the basics of GDScript. And you're right, but there's so many hidden options @export gives you that if you didn't know about these, you would be shooting yourself in the foot while you're creating your game in Godot. Let me tell you everything you need to know about @export. The most basic export is this, where you specify the type of the exported variable after the colon. In this case, it's an integer. If you omit the type, you have to initialize the value, then Godot will infer or figure out the type on its own. You can use other types, which will change how the inspector field behaves. You can also use float, boolean, and string. And if you expect a longer string and this one field just won't do, you can use @export multiline to create a bigger text box. You can also export nodes. But it helps to be more specific. You can specify any node type and limit the field to accept only those nodes, or those that inherit from the type. You can export resources, but this gets you a huge unwieldy drop-down list of possible values. It's better to limit the value to a specific resource type. Now only this resource and ones that inherit from it can be selected. You can limit the input to a range of values. Just use @export range and in parentheses put the minimum and maximum value. Then you get a slider in the inspector. And you can do that for integers as well by explicitly typing the variable as an int. If you don't need the slider to be crazy precise, you can add a step as the third parameter. You can put or greater and or less flags to allow typing in values outside of the range, while still keeping the slider confined to the range. You can initialize arrays to have Godot infer their types, or specify the type, in which case you are not required to give it an initial value, either by just declaring it to be an array or making it a typed array. However, if an array isn't initialized, its default value is going to be null, so it's always better to initialize it to an empty array rather than leave it null, to avoid unexpected errors. If you use an array of resources, you can drag and drop valid resources into it. Very useful. You can create an enum in code and use it as the type of the exported variable. The values will be stored as integers starting at 0 by default. You can also define an enum within the export like this. Now you don't get the default value like before, but you can specify one by initializing the variable to the index of the item you want to be default. If your variable's type is string, the inline enums value will be stored as a string rather than an integer, and then you initialize it by writing the item as a string. Both files and directories are exported by path. Using @export file, you can export any file, but it's better to limit the type of file you're looking for by specifying the extension in parentheses. In this case, I'm only looking for PNG files. You can export a path to a directory with @export dir. You can use @export group with any name you want. Now your fields are hidden under an expandable dropdown. You can optionally add a second parameter next to the group's name. This will automatically group up only the properties with this prefix. You can add a subgroup within a group with @export subgroup. You can also use export category, but this sort of breaks Godot's default dividing of properties based on classes they come from, so it's not recommended. For string variables only, you can use export placeholder to make a placeholder. If you type the exported var as color, you get a color picker in the inspector. And you can use export color no alpha to allow only solid colors. You can export integers and use them as bit flags to store multiple true-false values. Do it with export flags, and then you need to specify the names of the flags in the parentheses. Each one will have a value that is an exponent of 2, going from 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. And that about covers most of what you're ever gonna need. If you wanna see a real-life example of using exports and learn how to create awesome guns along the way, click on the video on screen. Thank you for watching.